started because Bill actually has a 12:50 flight to catch, and we want to get as much opportunity to hear from him and the respondents as we possibly can. So I want to just... Well, you know what? We're kind of thinking we'd like to do that with you and Emmanuel and Bill. Oh well. We'd like to keep you anyway, which is to say that this has really been a wonderful week, and so grateful for the many conversations that we have had, and just how truly wonderful and beautiful this has been. And so thank you to all of you, thank you to our presenters, and a special thanks to Edie Chapman, who's sitting in the back there.
Right here, Edie Chapman.
Whom Dean Nelson refers to as our logistics guru. I would like to introduce, it's not only exciting for us to have Bill McKibben here this morning, but it's also really exciting, something that's happened here at Point Loma in the last couple of years, and especially in the last couple of weeks. And so in some sense, having Bill here is not just about being able to hear what he has to say, but it's also a celebration for us. A couple of years ago, our president announced that he wanted us to become a fully sustainable university and to become the first school in the CCCU to accomplish that goal, and started a task force, a research and stewardship task force, which recently was renamed the Sustainability Task Force. And so we've been really kind of aggressively pursuing becoming sustainable. The next step in all of that is our just having 2 weeks ago passed through without any discussions in the faculty council, which surprises many of us, but at the same time, I guess maybe we shouldn't have a sustainability program here at the university, and so we'll be one of the first Christian universities to actually have a sustainability program as a part of our curriculum, and it's a very exciting thing for us. So I had asked this morning Harry Watkins. We have Joe Watkins as well. Harry Watkins, who's a professor of business, and who has really been not only one of the visionary members of the Sustainability Task Force, but the visionary and prime mover in getting our sustainability program developed to introduce Bill this morning.
Well, it's my great pleasure. About 2003, our business department became a school, and the dean of that school said, okay, our tagline is more than the bottom line, business education to change the world. And that was a catalytic moment in my life, because a rather self-satisfied marketing professor began thinking, okay, what does it mean to be about more than the bottom line as a Christian and as a business person? And that led me into the social justice literature. It led me into the sustainability literature. In my 50s, it broke my heart, and it transformed my life. I had my own prophetic epiphany. And that began me on a new journey. And part of that journey was to begin to develop relationships across the campus with some of my peers, many of whom have helped put on this conference. And to begin to have a vision for a different way of approaching society, and certainly a different role for business. One of the seminal series of readings that I have done was at the behest actually of Jamie Gates. I began reading some of Bill McKibben's work. And it was with a great delight that I discovered that here was an individual speaking out of a Christian worldview with a very long and consistent voice for sustainability, for creation care, for concern about global warming, for concern about social justice. And so it's a great honor for me to introduce this author. I'm just going to read from the book I've been reading recently. He wrote, it's the first account for a general audience of global warming. The End of Nature became an environmental classic, widely compared to Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. He has since written a score of other books on nature and culture, and most recently, Geek Economy, which speaks very much to my discipline. Over those 2 decades, he's also written dozens of essays, and he is also the seminal founder of the 350.org organization, which has been has garnered one of the largest gatherings of people marching for rethinking our carbon economy. So it's with great pleasure that I introduce our speaker, Bill McKibben.
Kind introduction. I confess that it's with some trepidation that I take to this pulpit in this chapel. For one thing, I'm a Methodist, and what little I know about Nazarene history leads me to think that it was a sense that the Methodists weren't quite up to the whole thing that led to the original foundation of this denomination. But more to the point, I feel quite ill-equipped to be in the company of really powerful theologians and religious thinkers like the people who've been speaking to you all week. I'm a complete charlatan in this regard. The furthest I ever rose in the ecclesial hierarchy was Sunday school teacher. I've been a Sunday school teacher for a long time, but in our tiny backwoods church, which would fit 4 times in this room, Sunday school really isn't a very the sort of bar for being a Sunday school teacher is can you take a tea towel on Christmas Eve and turn a 4th grader into a Palestinian shepherd? If you can, you're in. That's about all that's required. So I have, as I say, I feel overmatched and undergunned in intellectual terms. So I'm just going to tell a few stories about my work over the years, especially on this question of climate, which is the biggest problem that human beings have yet confronted. And the size of it is important. There are occasions when most problems, the differences in quantity don't add up to a difference in quality. They don't become philosophically different issues. If there are 5 million people who lack medical insurance or 30 million people, it's still essentially the same problem in sort of philosophical and ethical and whatever terms. But on occasion, rare occasion, there are changes in quantity so different that problems become qualitatively different as a result. We've always had environmental impacts of one kind or another ever since we started doing the various things that we do to survive. But they've always been rather limited. And that is what has changed. I'm wary, since I see some familiar faces of repeating very much from last night. But I'll pick up sort of one place where, to sort of make this point, one place where I kind of left off last night. Dean was asking me about a book I'd written about the book of Job, and its incredible power as a piece of nature writing, God's soliloquy at the end of speaking from the world, at the end of the book of Job, and I described the great beauty and power and the great sarcasm of that speech. God taunting Job, where were you when I laid down the corners of the universe, the morning stars singing for joy? Can you tell the proud waves where to break? Do you know where the thunderstorm is stored? On and on and on. And Job just has to say, no, I'm well out of my league here. I'm going to be quiet now. That's always been the position of human beings in relation to the natural world around them. We've always been small in comparison to something large. And that's a position that in the lifetimes of people people in this room has fundamentally shifted and changed. Now we are big enough to dramatically affect that world around us, in fact, to dominate it. We got the first sense of that, maybe, with the invention of atomic weapons and the sudden possibility of a cataclysm large enough to wipe out everything. And thank God, so far, we've avoided that and done a reasonably good job of figuring out how to avoid it. Mostly, I think, because our imaginations are competent to imagine the effects of a few large nuclear explosions. But it turns out that at least so far, our imaginations aren't competent enough to imagine the effects of the explosion of 1 billion pistons every minute in engines around the world, which in slightly, though only slightly slower motion, are driving a cataclysm of as large a proportion. What we've learned about climate change in the last 20 years is not just sobering, it's incredibly frightening. When I wrote The End of Nature 21 years ago, which was the first book about these topics, really, we knew that we were facing a problem. We knew enough about the molecular structure of CO2 to know that it would trap heat that should otherwise radiate back out to space. But it was emotionally difficult for us to really believe that we'd grown that large, that we'd be able to dominate these systems. Because basically everything that happens on the surface of the Earth, with the exception of tectonic and volcanic forces, is driven by that increment of the sun's energy trapped in our atmosphere. So how things melt, the speed of the wind, the progress of the seasons, the height of the oceans, on and on and on, are all driven by that. And it just seemed impossible that we'd gotten that big. Which is why for the first 4 or 5 years of that period, into the middle 1990s, science worked with incredible vigor to try to really understand the fundamentals of this problem. And by the mid-1990s, it accomplished that task. Our climatologists around the world had reached a rough and ready but pretty robust conclusion. We're heating the planet, and it was going to be a serious problem. And since then, it's as if the planet itself has been peer reviewing that science to make sure it's correct. We've had one warm year after another. All 10 of the warmest years on record have occurred in the last 15 years. It looks like this year may very well set the record as the warmest of all. The first 3 months of this year have been the warmest on record. We've come to understand just how poised, just how finely balanced the physical systems of the planet were, and how much damage has already been wreaked by relatively small increases in temperature. So far, the temperature of the planet has gone up about 1 degree due to human action, from roughly 59 degrees globally average to roughly 60, which doesn't sound like very much. And really, 20 years ago, we would have told you it wasn't enough to cause huge problems. But we were wrong. A number of systems are now in a state of violent and chaotic flux. We look at the rapid melt of sea ice in the Arctic in the summer of 2007, when we lost about 25% of the ice that had been there for a very long time. We look at the rapid melt of pretty much every glaciated system that we can find around the world. We look at the rapid change in hydrological systems. Warm air holds more water vapor than cold. We see big increases in evaporation and hence in drought in arid areas all over the world. And once that water is up in the atmosphere, it's going to come down someplace. So we see huge increases in the rate of torrential storm, of flood. There are place after place around the world. And since I've been listening in particular interest in Kathleen and reading, one of the great examples being, I just read the other day that the Red River in the Dakotas has been, the last 18 years has reached flood stage. They've had the 100-year flood 6 times in the last 15 years. That same kind of thing is happening all over the world. We're amping up this system, in other words, and the scary part of it all is that so far we've raised the temperature of the planet 1 degree, unless we put things very quickly to order, i.e. unless we very, very quickly get off coal and gas and oil. The consensus prediction of climatologists is that we're looking at degrees more temperature increase in the course of this century. If 1 degree melts the Arctic, we don't want to find out what 5 degrees does. Every indication that we have is that it will be very grim and very difficult indeed. Already, the Global Humanitarian Forum, which is done one study on this, estimates that about 300,000 people a year are dying from the effects of climate change. But that's a trivial number compared to what it will be in the not very distant future. All of which, in a way, is saying that it is a long and data-laden way of saying that we're in a completely different position than Job was when taunted by God. We're in the position of being able to taunt God right back. God says, "Do you tell the proud waves where to break, here and no further?" Job has to say, "No, that's your department." And we get to say, "Well, no, actually now it's us. The guess is that sea level, because of what we're doing, will rise someplace in the order of a couple of meters in the course of this century and continue rising for many centuries to come." That's not a trivial amount. It's enough to cause unbelievable damage and hardship for hundreds of millions of people, if not billions of people, who live and grow their crops in the fringes of the world's oceans. On and on and on. We're able to spit in God's face in a very different way than it's ever been possible to imagine before. Our conception of how the world works and what size we are compared to the divine is suddenly different. And if you think that this is doesn't present a certain kind of challenge for a religious worldview, go through the hymnals someday and take out all the hymns that locate sort of God's power in the image of the thunderstorm or the progress of nature in some one of its mighty forms. If you remove all those, not only have you taken out most of the good hymns, at least in the Methodist, you've also reduced by about 2/3 the size of the book. This is a serious, deeply serious, I think, problem for us as religious people to try to face and to figure out what it means and to figure out, more importantly, how we might go about what seems to me the obvious task of trying to make ourselves smaller rather quickly so that we can restore this balance in some rough, crude fashion. There's also, it strikes to me, an equally large and difficult and maybe almost intractable problem that comes as more out of the New Testament than the Old. And that's the problem. That's the problem caused by the incredibly unequal distribution of causes and effects of this particular crisis. Like I say, I'm a Methodist Sunday school teacher, so I have a very unsophisticated and simplistic view of the Gospels. And one of the things that I always liked about the Gospels is the fact that the apostles get to serve as sort of stand-ins for the rest of us. They're unbelievably dim. They forever losing the point of the story and having to say, "What's all this about again? Can you explain it then?" You know what? And Jesus on condition, love your God, love your neighbor, love your neighbor, over and over and over and over again. A zillion and a half times. We've never been unbelievably good at that. Witness the world that we've created is grievously divided between rich and poor. Really grievously divided, as deep a sin as it's possible to imagine. But now we're engaged in something really, in a sense, even altogether different. The kind of active and powerful hatred of our neighbors all over the world as expressed by what we're doing to their lives. I was talking last night about visiting Bangladesh in the middle of their first big outbreak of dengue fever. And to be there and realize that there are many thousands of people dying there or across Brazil or South America or other parts of Asia from a disease that was not endemic in these places until the last decade and now is spreading quickly because the mosquito that carries it likes the world that we're building. And then further to realize that none of these places are burning enough fossil fuel to have made anything like a material contribution to the change in the atmosphere, whereas the 4% of us who are Americans are currently producing about 25% of the world's CO2 and historically are responsible for about 40% of what we call the greenhouse effect. And further to realize that confronted with this fact for 20 years, we've done absolutely nothing to change our method of operation, our political economy, or whatever else. One's left with a pretty hard defense. It becomes pretty hard to defend the idea that one is loving one's neighbor in any very useful way. And I would submit to you that all the good work that we try to do through mission societies, through Habitat for Humanity, through that Heifer Project, through all the other things that we support, doesn't come close, not even within an order of magnitude of beginning to undo the damage that we're doing to those very places by pursuing the particular lifestyles that we pursue with the abandon that we pursue them. The scales are nowhere near right, and they won't even begin to be until we take difficult political action to change our lives in profound ways. And that will be the measure of whether or not we actually love our neighbors in any useful way in the century in which we live. And that's a, unfortunately, hard measure, because dealing with this problem at this point especially is going to be very, very hard. Had we started dealing with it 2 decades ago when we first knew about it, it would have been difficult but a little bit easier. The progress of those 2 decades, which have been the 2 decades that have seen by far the most combustion of fossil fuel in human history, has made the problem far, far more difficult to deal with. And the reality is that dealing with it won't be won't be in any way easy or graceful or elegant. It will require a lurching transformation from the economy that we know, built on centralized use of fossil fuel, to a very different economy built on very different resources, and we have to do it in record time if we're going to have any real impact on this problem at all. One way of saying it is that not only would we have to grapple finally with the truth that everyone in the world is not going to acquire a middle-class American lifestyle, we would also have to grapple with the fact that middle-class Americans are not going to be able to maintain exactly the lifestyle that we have grown accustomed to with its profligate use of energy. And I'm afraid that that's merely the reality reflected by the mathematics of the situation. We finally got a good number for where the red line is in January 2008 from a NASA team led by James Hansen, our foremost climatologist. And that team, as I said last night, reported finally that between the reams of paleoclimatic data that we had and real-time observations of things like the melt of the Arctic, we can now say with some confidence that the most carbon we can safely have in the atmosphere is 350 parts per million. For the 10,000 years of human civilization before the Industrial Revolution, the atmosphere held 275 parts per million CO2. We know that works. However you define civilization, you have Garden of Eden, Buddha, Shakespeare, that's 275 parts per million. Okay? That number begins to rise with the advent of the Industrial Revolution. We never know where the red line is, though we've begun to suspect, some decades ago that it was out there someplace. It was in 2008 that that number 350 finally came to the fore. It's a very hard number because we're already past it. We're at 390 parts per million and rising 2 parts per million a year. That's why the Arctic is melting. So it's no longer a question of taking, sort of cautionary action in the future to slow things down or whatever. We're like the guy who goes to the doctor and the doctor says, we're not like the guy who goes to the doctor and says, well, keep eating that way and someday your cholesterol will be too high and you'll be sorry. Not like the guy who goes to the doctor and says, look, you're in that zone where people keel over from heart attacks. Change what you're doing and hope against hope that it takes effect in time to keep you from keeling over yourself. We're already having strokes. That's what it means when the Arctic melts. We're not getting out of this hole and unscathed. and we're not getting out of it at all without enormous and significant change. That's the really depressing part. So don't breathe. I want to say just a couple of other things. One is that I think that change, though very traumatic, will actually be in the direction that's very useful and good for us in all kinds of ways, and that the world on the other side is sweeter than the one we inhabit now. As we were talking about last night, one of the effects of fossil fuels has been not only to make us rich and not only to destroy the climate, but also to separate us in profound ways one from another. The ability it gave us to become the most hyper-individualized people in the world, to live in splendid isolation in oversized, starter castles for entry-level monarchs scattered across the countryside, hither and yon, we've thought of as the great American dream, but in certain ways has been the great American nightmare from what we can tell in terms of people's reported satisfaction with their lives. People have become steadily less satisfied with their lives, precisely because they intuit this loss of connection and community. And it's not some shadowy intuition. From what we can tell, it's entirely true. The average American, as I said last night, has half as many close friends as the average American 50 years ago. That's a very large and very painful change. For a socially evolved primate, it's nothing short of excruciating. To think that 50 years ago you would have had twice as many people with whom you were close. That's what our society, in a certain sense, has arrived. So it's good news that we're going to have to figure out how to replace some of that fossil energy with other forms that by their nature are more intractably local, that will keep us closer to home. So for instance, with food, we will no longer be able to have the average bite of food travel 2,000 miles to reach your lips. When the day comes that we put a serious price on carbon through national and international treaty and legislation, that's the day that the 3,500-mile Caesar salad will cease, and we will instead learn to eat from closer to home. In some parts of the world, like right here, that will be no great problem at all. In other parts of the world, like Vermont, it will take a little getting used to, but not so much. I did a project a number of years ago where our family and I ate nothing that didn't come from our valley for the whole year. And it was, in fact, good eating and good fun, mostly because we made all sorts of new friends in the course of that time. I said last night that when sociologists looked at the farmer's market, they discovered that the average visitor was having 10 times as many conversations as the average shopper at a supermarket. That's a real change and a real powerful and beautiful one. The same kind of thing applies to almost every commodity that you can think of, including energy itself. Fossil fuel was very concentrated, very BTU rich. It came from a few particular places. It was extremely easy to transport. It therefore made great economic sense to centralize its combustion in a few huge coal-fired power plants or whatever. Exactly the opposite is true of the things that replace it. The sun and the wind are everywhere, but they're everywhere diffuse and scattered. And hence you need the equivalent of a farmer's market in energy. I have solar panels all over my roof. They're tied into the grid. On a sunny day, I'm a little utility. I'm sending electrons down the grid. My neighbor is cooling his beer before the Red Sox game with the sunlight that falls on my shingles. And that's a much more benign way of doing things. A, because you can put ecologically useful things like solar panels to work more easily. B, because it avoids the too big to fail vulnerabilities in our energy system that are at least as acute as the ones in our banking and financial system. That is to say, you don't have to send troops along a 5,000 yard, a 5,000 mile long straw through which to suck hydrocarbons from the Persian Gulf. In Vermont, we've lost a higher percentage of our citizens in the war in Iraq than any state in the Union. We're very tired of going to funerals, but I would gather we're going to be going to funerals as long as the central part of our economy lies under somebody else's sand. You also don't have just the kind of basic vulnerabilities of all kinds that come with overly centralized things. That is to say, If some terrorist decides for whatever reason that he wants to break my solar panels, then theoretically he can climb up on my roof with a hammer and do it. And if he does, then I'll have a problem. But nobody else will have a problem. It won't ramify down, and there won't be sort of deadly solar particles sort of spewing out into the atmosphere. It'll be contained. It'll be all right. The same sort of argument exists, I think, in almost every realm you can think of, including, not unimportantly, culture. It's very nice to know the one part, for instance, of the music industry that's growing fast is local performance and live performance and festival. People learning again how to enjoy the music in the company of each other. So I can posit, and I do posit in Deep Economy, my last book, and my next book will be out next month, a world that kind of sort of works even past fossil fuel, though very differently from the one we're used to. That requires us to, in many ways, live much more community-minded lives. Lives that, if you ask me, are much, much closer to the lives envisioned and described in the Gospels than the lives that we've been living for the last 50 or 75 years. The problem is, and here's where I'm going to end, the problem is that we also, even while we're making that transition to a more local world, need desperately to figure out how to solve these global problems, most of all climate change, which at some level we can only do working together. Unless we can agree as a world on a strategy, on a price for carbon that drives down the use of fossil fuel very quickly, then we won't get out of this in time. We'll see dramatic increases in temperature, and there's nothing that any local system can do to deal with changes as profound as those. You can be the best organic gardener in the world, but it still has to rain sometime, or else you're out of luck. So how to deal with this? How to put the kind of pressure on this system to overcome the immense power of vested interest and of inertia that's so far kept us from changing. That's what I want to talk about here at the end, mostly because I want to ask your help. We've spent the last few years experimenting in how to build this sort of movement that wasn't there before. I talked a good deal about the sort of roots of that last night, and I'm just going to describe what we've done in the last 2 years or so with this campaign that we called 350.org, that some of you have helped with, and I hope all of you will help with in the future. We took its name from that number that Jim Hansen and NASA provided in January of 2008, 350 parts per million CO2, beyond which they said it wasn't possible to have a planet similar to the one on which civilization developed and to which life on Earth is adapted. It seemed to us that those were good things, so we would work with that number. Now, it wasn't an obvious and intuitive choice for a rallying cry. People don't normally choose obscure scientific data points to try to rally people around. You choose some slogan, I have a dream, or whatever it is. The problem is that when you're working globally, it's very hard to do that because of the babel of languages in which we reside. Doing anything across and around the world is incredibly difficult, even for people who have unlimited resources. Coca-Cola, one of the few people who actually try to organize the world, you notice that their slogan at the moment is "Coke is it," a slogan literally devoid of meaning in any language. And the reason is that there are some of you who are of my vintage and old enough to remember the day when their slogan was "Coke adds life." Okay? The problem with that slogan, it turned out, was that they were spending large amounts of money in many parts of the world to put up billboards that turned out to say, "Coke brings your ancestors back from the dead." The sales was ineffective, and hence Coke is it. 350, Arabic numerals are the one thing that cross, maybe musical notation too, that crosses linguistic boundaries. Those 3 digits mean the same thing in Sao Paulo as they do in San Diego and in Stockholm and wherever else. And that's very, very useful, as it turns out. We set out in February of 2008 to try and organize this thing we were calling 350.org. And the idea was to take this pretty radical number and wrench it into the middle of the debate in the hope of shifting it in some profound way, adding scientific urgency to this overly patient and laborious political process that was getting nowhere. When I say we, I mean me and at the time there were 7 24-year-olds. And as I said last night, 7 was an auspicious number because there are 7 continents. So they divided them up, these young people, and set out to work. We didn't really have anything in the way of money or organization or anything, but we did have the good luck of finding people quickly everywhere around the world, mostly but not exclusively young people, who really wanted to take on this problem. We set as our target early on, we decided if we were going to make this splash, we need to do it all at once, that we pick a day, it turned out to be October 24th of last year, where we try around the world to take this number and make it real everywhere. So that was sort of our goal. Set out to organize and whatever. We worked as hard as we could. I was in constant motion. I was only home about 60 days last year, just in constant motion, and finding allies everywhere we could. But we really didn't know whether or not it was going to work in any significant way. In fact, we all gathered in New York, the 7 of us, thank you very much, 3 or 4 days beforehand to a couple of borrowed offices downtown to sort of monitor the end of it, writing press releases, and basically just waiting around on our laptops, because we told everyone, we need you to instantly send images of what you're doing, upload them as soon as they happen. I won't, let's make these slides work. I'll cut to the chase. It worked, as it turned out. On that October 24th, on that Saturday, there were 5,200 simultaneous rallies in 181 countries. So CNN said it was the most widespread day of political action in the planet's history on any topic. And by quite a considerable margin, 181 countries is pretty much all the countries there are. Not North Korea, but pretty much everywhere else. We got the first intimation that it was going to work, actually, 2 days before, on Thursday. And I'll tell you the story of this, because it kind of gives you some idea about how we sort of somewhat clueless and amateur, but ultimately effective way in which we were organizing. We got a call on that Thursday from these two wonderful sisters, 18 and 19, in Addis Ababa, in Ethiopia. Now, we met them. We organized this little training conference for young people from across Africa 6 months before in Johannesburg. And we had people from almost every country. Most of them had never left their countries. Most had never been on an airplane. Many we had to sort of hand walk through the Johannesburg airport because it was just too scary and crazy, you know. But they came to this week-long training session and they completely understood what we were on about and how to make it work and got very into it. And then they scattered back out across Africa. We did the same thing in Central Asia and in the Caribbean and South America and wherever else. But they scattered back out across Africa. And then we didn't hear from them for quite a while, for the most part, because the internet really often doesn't work in much of Africa. It's difficult in many places to use it reliably. And the internet is how we operate. Skype is our, backbone of our operation. But we got this call that Thursday from these two sisters in Addis. And they're 18 and 19, they're wonderful souls. And they said, well, it's going pretty good here. We had our demonstration a little early because there was something going on the Saturday. There was some government thing. So we're having ours a little early. We've got 15,000 people out in the streets in Addis doing this 350 demonstration. We got every high school in the city is involved. And so they're like, whoa, that's pretty good. In fact, that's unbelievable because Addis Ababa is not the place where you'd expect this to just sort of break out. They said the one problem is we can't get pictures because the internet's down in it. We're just despairing because we badly needed those pictures to go show them to Reuters and AP and CNN so they'd get the sense that this was going to be big and they'd cover it and whatever. I could hear my colleague who's worked in Africa all year on the phone with Dad going, Turns out there was one five-star hotel, Odyssey, which is where all the development people go when they go to visit. Okay? Go there, go to the lobby. Well, the first 3 young people that we sent in with the computer with the pictures got kicked out because they were young black people and they weren't really welcome in the lobby. Finally found a white person who went in and sat at the bar, ordered a drink, and pressed the button. And, 5 minutes later, we had pictures like that. Can we turn the light a little bit so we can actually see these? We had pictures, a bunch of pictures like this, and 5 minutes after that, they were up on, let me get these lights now, up on CNN. Quite astonishing images that really blew our minds. So I'm going to show you very quickly a bunch of these for just a few minutes, okay? There's 2 things I want you to notice as you're going through. Just really 2 things as I tell you stories like these. One, this replicates this argument I was making before about the localized world that we're going to be living in. Okay? Thanks to the kind of new architecture of the world offered by the internet, we can start to do politics in the way that we do farmers markets. Okay? Everybody can do their thing where they are, but now we have a way of bringing them together as well. When we were first doing this, people said, do a march on Washington. We said, we're not going to do a march on Washington. It's stupid to tell people to drive across the continent to protest global warming. And it's kind of old anyway, This is what they did in the 60s. This is different. We're in a different world. So, and the other, but that's one point. The other point I want you to notice as you're going through is, if anyone has ever told you that environmentalism is something for affluent white people, they're incorrect. Most of the faces you're going to see are black or brown or Asian, and most are poor and most are young. That's what most of the world is, okay? And what do you know? They actually care just as much about the future as any of us. Maybe more, because they're going to be wrecked even more quickly than the rest of us. The second picture that came in 10 minutes after that one from Odyssey was just as unlikely and just as interesting. They're American soldiers in Afghanistan. They made a 350 with their sandbags, and they said, we're parking our Humvees for the weekend and walking. They actually began in New Zealand, and then just moved around the world. I'm going to show you, we have 25,000 pictures in our Flickr account, so if you want to look at more, please feel free. But it just started from one corner of the world to the other, and some of them are incredibly beautiful. I don't know if you can really see the face of that woman in the middle, but because of where it came from, it moved me to tears the second I saw it. I was in tears much of that 36 hours watching these pictures come in, mostly from places that I'd never really heard of before, okay? But we had 300 big demonstrations across India, almost all young people. We had that's someplace in the Buddhist world, I don't know where, but I just loved the picture. Many from very poor places. These are dugout canoes, someplace in the Congo River near Kinshasa. They didn't have a digital camera. They took a picture. They developed it in someone's home darkroom. It obviously didn't come out very well because they had to write in what they had on their banner and markers. Then they scanned it into a computer and sent it to us. But someplace there on the Congo River, there's somebody with a 350 T-shirt, and they, made this connection. That's another bad picture, but it's an incredibly impressive, endless line of serious-looking young men on bicycles making their point. Place after place. We had 350 scuba divers under the Great Barrier Reef. Istanbul, it had the worst flooding in its history 6 weeks before, dozens of people killed. We had 6 huge rallies like that there. Lots of great public art, all over the place. That's from the Space Needle. That's the colors of the Venezuelan flag. I just like that picture. It's an operating room in Puerto Rico. Hopefully they didn't stop for too long. Lantern dancers in Australia. That's an interesting picture for this audience. That's the head of the Muslim community in South Africa, nativist leader behind him, Archbishop Tutu's successor as Anglican Archbishop in the Crimson there, leading a really big interfaith parade through the streets of Cape Town. Pentecostal school in Ghana, the perfect example, environmental foundation, excellent thing. Wheaton College, and I always show this to people because in many parts of the country people don't know the importance of that picture. Wheaton, of course, one of the most important evangelical liberal arts colleges in the country. even 3 or 4 years ago, there wouldn't have been a big environmental demonstration at the school where Billy Graham had gone. That there was a very good sign.
Is Greg still here? Greg Schreck?
Yeah, Greg helped organize this whole
Or did
thing.
he already leave? One of our
Yeah.
conference members was
Yeah.
organized.
The airport did a great job.
He's at the airport.
I've been at Bethlehem a few weeks before. Bethlehem's a hard place even to get to, and certainly a hard place to get people to. But we've gotten people from around the region who wanted to do something. The Dead Sea is shrinking rapidly as temperatures warm. So their plan, because of the logistical problems, was to say, in Jordan, we'll do a giant human tree on the bank, in Palestine, a giant 5, in Israel, a big 0. A very moving sort of reminder that we might need to put aside some other problems from time to time. We did a lot of these big human scrabble things. That's 10,000 people from the Red Fort in Delhi. That's Sydney, under the London Eye, along the Thames, and Copenhagen. That was a picture that BBC put together for us that night, kind of making the point that we better work across borders, you know. We were very big on iconic locations everywhere we could be. So some places that meant beautiful palaces. It was an autumn Saturday in the U.S., so that meant football stadiums. That's Syracuse and the Syracuse cheerleaders helping us out. Just place after place after place after place. Bhopal, scene of the greatest environmental crime of the last century. It was wonderful to me that they're even willing to engage with the rest of the world in any way. Lots of climbers. These guys got in a little bit of trouble because they weren't really supposed to be. They rappelled down there in the middle of the night and were there when the cable cars started coming. That's a picture from Chiapas that I show you to give you a sense of scale, because on the next picture, can you see those same banners now a little tiny against the scale of the Great Canyon? It was all over Mexican TV news that night. Okay, this is one of my favorite pictures. Soweto, homeland of resistance to apartheid. They did 350 bungee jumps, but what was really important was they strung the cord for the bungee thing between the 2 cooling towers of a defunct coal-fired power plant in Soweto. This is what we need to do with coal-fired power plants the world over, okay? That's their highest and best use. One of my students in Middlebury in a time-lapse camera. That's my daughter in Vermont with sap buckets in front of the, we're going to lose our maple trees. 300 big demonstrations across China, which is not an easy place to organize. One got broken up by the police, the other 299, they walked right up to the line and didn't cross it. And they were great. Those are Chinese youth making a human wind turbine in Inner Mongolia. If you look behind, you can see the edge of the largest wind farm in the world. Lots of groups involved, lots of places. That picture, that's one of my favorite pictures. She started out that morning with a bunch of friends, but they had to go through like 6 U.S. Army checkpoints to get to the Hanging Gardens in Babylon, and most of them just got scared eventually and went home. And she determined to stick with it, and I love that picture. Honduras was in the middle of a military coup and under curfew. It didn't stop having a big demonstration. The Maldives, one of my favorite places in the world, going to be underwater in the next few decades because the highest point in the country is 2 meters above sea level. The youth held this great meeting in the lagoon. The government itself, this is an entirely Muslim country. Mohammed Nasheed, the president of the country, taught his entire cabinet how to scuba dive. They held an official cabinet meeting underwater on the edge of their dying coral reef and passed a 350 resolution to send to the UN. Stump in Tasmania, great public art all over the world. We didn't, on purpose, involve celebrities in this action. One of the points we wanted to get across was that people were capable of dealing with this themselves, that it wasn't too complicated, that they didn't need some movie star to tell them how to do it, and the only celebrities we had, in a sense, were scientists, and that was very nice. But we did take over Times Square for the day, and took those big jumbotrons that are normally showing ads, and we showed thousands of these pictures as they were uploaded in real time on those jumbotrons all afternoon, and it was really fun for us, but it was mostly fun for people all over the world who we've been telling they were going to do this, and they just loved the idea of being connected in that way, being in their home place, but also being part of something very large. It was very effective media-wise. We owned Google News news for about 36 hours because there was no story with more links and things coming in. On the front page of almost every newspaper in the world. That's the highest point in the Antarctic. These are just places that you wouldn't expect normally perhaps to organize, or people that you wouldn't necessarily expect to be organizing. We have a whole file of hundreds of pictures, sort of like this one from Yemen, one of the toughest countries in the world. If you look at the zero, it's all women in full burqa, covered head to toe, forming that. In our iconography, we say, well, they wouldn't be interested in something like global warming. But of course they are. That's Abu Dhabi and oil sheikdom. Those are oil sheiks down front. They know they're going to run out of oil someday. They'd like to own the next industry too, which is why you can see the world's largest solar array directly behind them there in the desert. Just place after place. And we also had there's now 800 or 900 pictures in a file just labeled 350 adorable. That girl in the middle just kills me. So beautiful, and by the time she's ready to have kids, she won't be able to live where she grew up. She'll probably be a refugee someplace. Those babies had all been born the same day in August, and their parents met in the maternity ward, and they had a little party on October 24th to sort of think about their future. From the sublime to the ridiculous, those are electric golf carts. Mostly poor people everywhere, okay? This is people in a poor slum in a poor city in Kenya. This is part of an orphanage in Indonesia. They spent the day collecting bottles and put them in that 350 thing, and they sent us a little note, the orphans, and at the end, the note said, even though no one caring about us, we caring about the earth. As I said, there were a number of times when I was in tears during the course of this weekend. This is Bangladesh. If you're making 40 cents a day or whatever, making t-shirts, most of our t-shirts come from Bangladesh, you can't take a day off to go protest. You can stop for a little while, and people get in factories all over Bangladesh to make this same point. That's all pictures I'm going to show you. That's my crew of 7 young people who really pulled this off. Look, we didn't win. We went to Copenhagen with enormous momentum 6 weeks later, and we convinced 117 of the world's nations to sign on to this 350 target, which was a fairly remarkable achievement. It was pretty much the talk of the place, and the number was everywhere. But those 117 weren't the right 117. They didn't include the most powerful and most addicted countries on Earth. They were mostly the poor countries of the planet. We still have an immense amount of work to do. We're charging full steam ahead. This year, the date most important is October 10. And instead of doing a kind of global political rally like we did last year, we're doing what we call a global work party. And there will be thousands and thousands and thousands of places all over the world, including, I hope, right here, where people are doing very practical things, getting together as a group to put up solar panels, dig community gardens, lay out bike paths, insulate homes, whatever it is that makes sense in that place, that they'll be doing it with the big 350 in the background so we can take this kind of picture. The point is not that we're going to solve this problem one project at a time. We are not. The point is we need a way, in essence, of shaming our putative leaders. We need some way to say to them, we're getting to work, what about you? If I can climb up on the roof of my university and pound in solar panels, surely you can take to the floor of the Senate where you're actually paid to work and pass the kind of legislation that we need. We need, our motto now is get to work, because that's what we need to do. And we very, very much need, among other things, the involvement of religious communities and churches. It's been a great privilege for me to watch over the last few years, finally, the emergence of a strong environmental movement. Some of it very strong. A few weeks before October 24th, Patriarch Bartholomew, of the leader of 400 million Orthodox Christians, put out a statement in which he said, and this is a statement I admire for its brevity and bluntness compared to the usual indigestible prose put forward in various religious documents and commissions and manifestos. He said his entire statement was, global warming is a sin, and 350 is an act of redemption. Okay? That was quite useful. We had and that's the reason, and one of the reasons that there were all those pictures from Kazakhstan and places all across that swath of Europe. Let me end by telling you about a church service that took place in Copenhagen that was really wonderful. It was in the middle of the conference, and it was already clear that things were going pretty badly. But it was a church service at the Lutheran Cathedral. There's all Lutherans there, and the big cathedral in town is a Lutheran cathedral, very beautiful. The service was amazing. Archbishop Tutu and the Archbishop of Canterbury preached the service. But the two most moving parts were the beginning, when the choir processed in, and they were carrying, 8 or 10 of them were carrying lumps of dead coral from parts of the world where coral reefs have been bleached by rising ocean temperatures. 8 or 10 of them were carrying rocks that had emerged from beneath the melting glaciers of Greenland in the last couple of years. And 8 or 10 of them were carrying these big wicker baskets of stunted, withered ears of corn from drought-stricken parts of Africa. I was in tears watching that because part of what it reminded me was that we've waited too long to prevent this problem from happening. We're not going to stop global warming. All we're going to do now is prevent it from being any worse than it has to be. The other moving part of that day was at the end of that service, when they rang the great bell of the cathedral 350 times, and then thousands of churches across Christendom did the same thing that afternoon, echoing that message. And whenever people go on and tell me about all the great debates between science and religion and on and on and on, it doesn't strike me that these are either all that important or all that insoluble. Yes, there are sort of interesting debates to be had about the nature of creation and on and on and on. But the thing that we now all face and should all be able to agree on is that what we're dealing with now is the rapid and powerful decreation of the planet. And it's about time that we figure out how to work easily and powerfully together around it. So I hope that you all will figure out ways to join us on the 10th of October in trying to make that happen. And I thank you very much, as I say, for your attention to this non-theologic and non-prophetic. We're organizing. We're doing what we can every day, and I don't know whether it'll add up in time or not, but there is great solace, at least in trying. So thank you all enormously.